some invertebrates at least, we have very good evidence that they can suffer. And if they can suffer, then I think that suffering matters, and I think it matters equally to suffering of human beings where we're talking about similar kinds of suffering. And that's a critical point, because very often we think anything that happens to animals cannot be as important as things that happen to humans. That was the attitude that I had for the first 24 years of my life, until I was a graduate student at Oxford and was alerted to some of the things that we're doing to animals. In fact, one of the first books I read on that was a book that Dale just mentioned that Rachel Carson wrote the foreword to, Ruth Harrison's wonderful Animal Machines. But as I said, I had come to the view that, well, you know, there were lots of important issues about humans. At that time, there was the Vietnam War. There were, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. All of those things were really important, and I should be focusing on them and working for them as I had indeed. But animals, no, doesn't really matter. But once I started thinking about this, was prompted to think about it by a chance meeting with a Canadian philosophy student at Oxford by the name of Richard Keshen, then I started to see that my past attitude was really a prejudice of a kind that by then we were very familiar with, the prejudices against taking seriously the interests of people of a different race, or prejudices against taking seriously the interests of women, which had been held, to some extent still were, but certainly had been very strongly held in past eras. That in fact the way we treat animals really parallels in some ways the way that the white Europeans who thought that the slave trade was an acceptable moral practice were thinking about Africans. Just that we are more important, we're the ones who really count, they're not, so we can use them for our ends. And that's why I didn't coin, but I applied the term speciesism to this practice, to make the analogy with racism and sexism, which we're familiar with, and which we can see to be a kind of bias that people have because it's convenient for them and it fits the things that they want to do. Okay, so if that bias is wrong, and if the suffering of animals matters, and is similarly to similar suffering of humans, and I acknowledge that cognitive differences can make a difference to certain kinds of suffering, but we don't think that the suffering of, let's say, human infants doesn't matter, because they're not cognitively at the level that we are, and indeed non-human animals, many of them are at the cognitive level of human infants or superior levels. If we think that the suffering of infants still matters when they're in pain, if we want to relieve their pain, we want to stop them, pain being inflicted on them, then that ought to be just as important in the case of non-human animals. But if it is just as important, then we have to take numbers into account. The amount, the quantity of suffering matters. And when we do that, when we take animals into account, the number is simply vast. It's really hard to get your mind around it. So take one figure. It's been estimated that there are 74 billion vertebrate land animals raised and killed for food each year. That's about 10 times the entire population, human population of the planet. Another perhaps even more dramatic way of looking at it is this. It's been estimated that the number of humans who have ever lived since our species became separate might be around 108 billion. So if we restrict ourselves to vertebrate animals again, but this time not just to land animals, let's include fish. Fish can suffer, they're vertebrates. Why should they be excluded? Then, every 2 months, we kill approximately the same number of those animals as all of the humans who've ever existed since we separated from other species on this planet. Every 2 months. The scale is simply incredible, and by any standards, I think, of suffering, animal suffering mattering. This is a really, really important problem. Here's another way of putting that, and I'm going to refer to Yuval Harari, whose book *Sapiens*, I'm sure many of you have read, and he has a recent book, 21 Lessons as well. So he talks about the fact that the Earth is home now to 7 billion humans, who, if you put them all together, would weigh about 300 million tons. It's home to, he says several dozen, but you know, roughly 74 billion, perhaps, well, that's the number killed each year, so maybe not at any one moment. If you put together all the farm animals on the world, that would be about 700 million tons. In contrast, he says, if you take all the large wild animals left on Earth, all the penguins, baboons, alligators, dolphins, wolves, tuna fish, lions, and elephants, put them on a large scale, if you can imagine that, they'll weigh less than 100 million tons. So we are outweighing that by 3 times, and the farm animals that we create by 7 times. Total, we and the animals we produce outweigh the large wild animals by 10 times. And Harari is not only concerned about the way we've shrunk the room for wild animals, the space for wild animals on this planet, which is an indication of the damage we're doing to the environment, but he's also concerned about the suffering that we inflict on them. And he talks about the farm animals in particular, the vast majority of whom, of course, are indoors, closely confined, very crowded, in factory farm conditions, where their welfare isn't really an issue. Let me go back and quote Ruth Harrison once again. She has a famous line saying, "Cruelty is acknowledged," she's talking about the farming industry, "cruelty is acknowledged only where profitability ceases."